Today, we're diving into a presidency that quite literally reshaped the modern world, the administration of George W. Bush. This was an era absolutely defined by unprecedented crisis. Now, Bush holds a pretty rare spot in American history, right out of the gate. He's actually only the second presidential son to ever take the highest office, right on the heels of John Quincy Adams. And while he went into the White House with his eyes firmly set on domestic policy, well, global events had a very different plan.
Take a look at this quote. The true history of my administration will be written 50 years from now. It's a fascinating thought directly from Bush himself, right? When you're leading a country through back-to-back generation-defining crises, the immediate reactions are usually polarizing, even chaotic. Bush knew that the ultimate judgment of his two terms, the policies, the wars, the economic roller coaster, would really only become clear with the long lens of hindsight. So today, we're going to lay out the facts of those two terms to see exactly what history is going to be evaluating.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover his early life and Texas roots, the tumultuous 2000 election, 9/11 and the war, his second-term trials, and finally, that legacy left to history.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Early Life and Texas Roots.
Before sitting in the Oval Office, Bush was forging a path that kind of blended his East Coast establishment ties with a very distinct Texas persona. He was born in New Haven, Connecticut in 1946 while his dad, George H.W. Bush, was at Yale. But the family soon packed up and headed to Midland, Texas for the oil business. George W. actually followed his dad's academic footsteps, graduating from Yale in 1968. Now, his political career didn't just take off overnight. In 1978, he lost a run for the U.S. House of Representatives, but he kept his eye on the prize, and by 1994, he successfully ousted incumbent Ann Richards to become the governor of Texas.
In between those political milestones, Bush built up a seriously diverse resume. He served in the Texas Air National Guard, went on to Harvard Business School, and then headed back to Midland to try and carve out a spot in a pretty tough Texas oil economy in the 1980s. During this time, he was also getting some invaluable political chops as an advisor for his dad's vice presidential and presidential campaigns. Oh, and he even became the managing partner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. So he was really mixing business pursuits with a highly visible public profile.
But perhaps the most crucial part of this era was a major personal transformation. He had married Laura Welch in 1977, and they welcomed twin daughters, Jenna and Barbara, in 1982. But it was right around his 40th birthday when a massive shift happened. Bush gave up drinking alcohol entirely and got much more serious about his Christian faith. This newfound discipline really became the anchor of his personal life, right as he was gearing up for some of his biggest political challenges.
Moving on to Section 2, the tumultuous 2000 election.
Riding high on his success as Texas governor, Bush set his sights on the White House. And this campaign, it would become one of the most intensely debated in modern history. He clinched the 2000 Republican nomination by pushing a philosophy he called compassionate conservatism. Originally, his platform was laser-focused on domestic stuff, major tax cuts and big education reform. It was a strategic pivot to pull in moderates, projecting a brand of conservatism that focused on community support and schools. And clearly, that message struck a chord with the Republican base. But the general election against Vice President Al Gore was incredibly fractured. Here's the split. George W. Bush won the Electoral College with 271 votes, but he actually lost the popular vote to Gore. As you can imagine, this completely split result immediately set the stage for a seriously tense political climate. And honestly, the whole thing hinged on just one state, Florida. Because the vote there was razor thin, an automatic recount was triggered. And this wasn't just a simple recounting of ballots. It escalated fast. Both campaigns were fighting tooth and nail in federal court. The real turning point, and a decision that is still highly controversial today, came when the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and ordered Florida to stop a subsequent recount. That legal finality is what locked in Bush's 271 electoral votes and officially cemented his path to the presidency.
Which brings us to Section 3, 9/11 and the war.
So Bush entered the White House with this big domestic agenda on taxes and education. But on a Tuesday morning in late summer, the entire trajectory of his presidency, and really the whole world, was irreversibly altered. On September 11, 2001, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda launched a coordinated attack on the United States, killing almost 3,000 people. The targets were devastating. Hijacked commercial planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth plane, headed for the Capitol, was heroically overtaken by passengers and crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The sheer scale of this tragedy abruptly and permanently shifted the administration's focus away from domestic reform directly to national security.
In the wake of the attacks, Bush made a declaration that would absolutely define American foreign policy for the next decade. He declared a worldwide war on terrorism. That single phrase mobilized a massive scale of military, intelligence, and diplomatic resources. It wasn't just a reaction to one event. It was the start of an expansive, multi-front global campaign.
And this war on terror quickly opened up two massive military fronts. First, the administration took the nation into battle in Afghanistan, going directly after the Taliban regime that had harbored al-Qaeda. Then, Bush expanded the scope of the war and waged a military campaign against the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. These were two incredibly consequential military actions that absolutely dominated the global conversation and dictated the rest of his time in office.
Now for Section 4, Second-Term Trials.
Going into the 2004 election, national security was obviously the main theme. But Bush was facing some serious headwinds. His re-election campaign was heavily jeopardized by the growing unpopularity of the Iraq War. The nation was fiercely divided on the broader war on terror. But despite these huge hurdles, Bush still managed to defeat Massachusetts Senator John Kerry in another very close race, securing his second term.
That second term, however, proved full of trials. Domestically, his administration faced severe criticism. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, the federal response was heavily criticized as being far too slow to help the victims. On top of that, regarding his ongoing foreign policy, there were growing complaints that in his aggressive pursuit of terrorists, Bush had become insensitive to civil liberties and core American values. These were massive domestic challenges that really weighed down his approval ratings.
And then came the economic shockwave. A subprime mortgage crisis combined with slowed growth hit the U.S. economy incredibly hard. In the middle of all this panic, Congress initially failed to pass a bailout bill meant to support failing banks. That congressional inaction triggered even more panic, which ultimately led to a massive stock market crash on September 29, 2008.
777 points. To put that into perspective, that is how far the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted in a single day. It was a staggering, historic drop. It wiped out immense wealth and really signaled just how deep this recession was going to be, completely defining the final months of the Bush presidency.
Finally, Section 5, a legacy left to history.
After 8 years, years defined by a disputed election, the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history, 2 wars, a horrific natural disaster, and an economic collapse, Bush returned to private life in Texas. And his own retrospective on all of this is pretty fascinating. Despite the absolute mountain of crisis he navigated, he publicly insisted that being president had been a joyful experience for him. More importantly, his primary defense of his legacy was this. He firmly maintained that he had accomplished his most critical goal of keeping the nation safe from further terrorism after 2001.
Which brings us to our final, provocative question, based on everything we've just unpacked together, from compassionate conservatism and the disputed 2000 election to the sheer trauma of 9/11, the wars, the fallout from Katrina, and the financial crash of 2008, how will the history books of the next 50 years judge the Bush administration? He believed it would take time for the true impact to be understood. So, what do you think history will conclude? Thank you so much for joining me, and we will catch you next time.